We are delighted to explore a wonderful new subject for our first February JASA webinar, Collecting Mingei. I'm going to be joined on the screen now with our three guest speakers. Japanese folk art and crafts both fall into the collecting category Mingei. This overarching term covers everything from pre-industrial crafts to handmade everyday tools and vessels. To begin a rich discussion today, I am happy to introduce our three presenters, Kyoko Mimura, Tai Heineken, and David Kahn, and their extraordinary commitment to this subject. Kyoko Mimura, former head of international programs at the Mingeikan in Tokyo, and a lecturer on Japanese art history and aesthetics at Waseda University in Tokyo. Tai Heineken, Joint Director of Studio Japan in Kingston, New Jersey, and co-author with Kyoko Heineken of Tansu, Japanese Traditional Cabinetry, which will be out in its third edition, published by Random House Penguin this April in a new ebook format. And David M. Kahn, Executive Director of the Adirondack Experience in upstate New York and a JASA board member. We have invited them to discuss their approaches to Mingei. Let us begin with Kyoko Mimura, who will define the category and introduce the perspective of Yanagi Soetsu, the founder of the Mingeikan. Thank you.
Thank you, Ing, for the introduction. I guess I'm allowed to start now, right? Oops. Am I on? Yes. Hello. Thank you very much for the introduction. I am Kyoko Mimura. Actually, I was asked to introduce myself. I was brought up in New Jersey. And I was in New Jersey until my 6th grade. And then I moved to Japan. I was born in the United States. My connection with the Mingeikan was in my high school years when I was still struggling with the Japanese language, but actually wanting to know more about what Japanese traditions and artifacts was like. It was not as an anthropological thing because I was still in high school, but really wanting to learn about the arts. And interestingly enough, I started volunteering at the Mingeikan because there was nobody at the museum that could speak in English. And all the English language letters at the museum were just thrown away, actually. So I started to volunteer as translating those. Interestingly enough, I ended up working at the Mingeikan after a journalistic career, and was there from 1990s, the early 1990s, until 2011. So that was quite a long time. So let me start with my presentation. Here we go. There we go. We're very strict on time, so let me start. How do I get to the next?
Kyoko, if you could please click the
there we
slideshow
go.
Mode. Oh, okay.
Slideshow mode. Here we go. Is this it?
Yes, thank you so much.
Thank you. Okay. This is the Mingeikan. I would like you to welcome to the Mingeikan. It is pretty much in the center of Tokyo. Mingeikan, once you step inside, you have to take your shoes off, put slippers on, and you are received into this area. Okay. Now, what is Mingei? I understand that Mingei is a new chapter today for the society. Mingei, this is another photograph of the Mingeikan. The entrance is over here. You can see that with each different exhibition, you have a different presentation. The whole museum, everything in the museum changes with each exhibition. You go up the stairs and the rooms look like this. Each room has a place where you can sit. Okay, so what is Mingei? Min means the people and gei means the art. Actually, it's a new word that was coined in 1926. So this word is not even 1 century old yet. And probably one of the interests of why it is not so familiar yet is because of the English translation, folk or craft. It doesn't justify actually the meaning of the term because it is actually an art that is made by the people, but professionally made. Let me go on. Okay, these ideas actually in the 1920s, or when it started around the turn of the century, 1900s, were prevailing against the original idea of beauty and art and beauty. Yes, because art implied power, social status associated with taste and beauty was, of course, a philosophical term, but it also implied in everyday life luxurious, elegant, costly, rare, institutionally accredited, refined, individual pieces, of course, with technical skill, which coincides with Mingei. So let me introduce you to the man who coined the word. This is Soetsu Yanagi, around the age 30. He was born in 1889 and died in 1961. So it'll give you an idea of the time frame in which the term was coined. At the time of this is him when he got married, yes. He was a philosopher. There are many words that define him. He was considered an aesthetic, a philosopher, a prolific writer, a publisher, an educator. But I would also like to add that he was a pioneer in creating, defining an aesthetic that maybe people had somewhere around, but it wasn't defined in words. He was a producer, a fantastic designer. Interestingly enough, he was a man that people often think that he was geared only to Japanese aesthetics. But if you look at his wife, interestingly enough, she is one of Japan's first opera singers. Okay, so what is Mingei? He defined it in many words because he tried to introduce it, the concept with words that people would understand. So let me introduce you to what he called the proposition on Mingei. They're like the conditions of what works of Mingei should be. And I will just introduce you 5 basic ideas that he introduced. First of all, it had to be beautiful, but it had to have a practical use to it. It had to be utilitarian. So what does this mean? He said, it is beauty born of sincere use and function. Now, function did not at that time coincide with the term of beauty, which had a very more deeper philosophical term to it. By the way, I am introducing to you the works from the Mingeikan collection. Yanagi's words again, beauty should not be sought outside of our life, but should be found inside it. He is coming to the idea of an anonymous creator, right? True beauty of an object lies within the beauty of utility. He is pushing this idea that beauty should be in everyday life and be used every day. Yes. Now, another thing he said, it should be commonplace, ordinary, or normal things. Again, commonplace did not fit within the concept of art or beauty at that time. But he meant commonplace, meaning normal things, healthy, everyday things. Normal meant natural, and natural meant beautiful. It is within the simple, unaffected works where astonishing beauty dwells. Yes. And it should be created by nameless craftsmen, not notable individuals. This does not mean, though, however, he is denying the individual talent. The nature of Mingei necessitates the cooperation of many. For example, these pots, you need somebody who makes the clay, you need somebody who kicks the wheel, you need somebody who splashes the glaze on, you need somebody who fires it. It is a cooperative creation of many. Mingei craftsmanship is healthy. Now, healthy was also not a word to describe beauty or art at that time. The whole purpose is to serve life. It is to enrich the individual and also to enrich the spirit of the creator. Proposition on Mingei, another one that Yanagi said, it should be made in quantity and affordably priced. Now, quantity and affordably priced, again, was against the idea of exclusive art. Yes, but this is an interesting phrase that I have translated, written by Yanagi. Practicability necessitates large production and low cost, right? Large production with less cost gives more chance to the birth of true beauty, meaning that beauty on the craftsman or the artist side can be created only with the trained arm. Okay? There is no righteous beauty in what wanders apart from simplicity. Interestingly enough, before the Bauhaus was founded, the founders visited Yanagi in his house in Shibuya. Okay, next proposition on Mingei. It should not be displayed, but to be appreciated in daily use. Daily use doesn't mean everything. For example, what I'm showing you here is the curtain for a traveling theater. Okay, Mingei is your true companion for life. Now he's trying to say that it should be closer to you, your heart. For the creator, it is the hand that creates and that connects to your heart, a very physical term, okay? So the qualities of Mingei he is expressing in all these interesting adjectives, right? Art purifies the world. Now this is something that he said before he came to the term of Mingei. Art purifies the world and is the power to beautify, and beauty is love. This is just a sidebar of Yanagi going to Korea in the 1920s, before he coined the term of Mingei. Beauty of art always transcends borders. In other words, it always transcends differences. And it is probably something that we need today and we treasure today. So this is Yanagi when he coined the word Mingei. And it really needed many, many years of preparation for him. With the Mingeikan, where I used to work for, he wanted to show that it was one creation of beauty because he wanted to introduce the philosophical term of beauty with the combination of a physical being, and that would be the standard of beauty, an introduction of something that he could show that everybody can reach fulfillment within everyday life with beauty. Now, this is probably one of the world's first model home that he tried to show beauty. It looks Japanese, but it doesn't look Japanese. Maybe you could see there's a fireplace, a very modern genkan. It looks entranceway. It looks Japanese, but look, some of the windows look more Korean. The windows look more British. And this is a dining table and a chair with a beautiful fireplace and maybe a traditional kitchen, but with works from all over the world. Yanagi was known for his new aesthetic and was invited to lecture at Harvard for one whole year, 1929 to 1930. And this was the time he introduced the word or the idea of Mingei to the Occidental world. And he also held an exhibition of Otsue at the Fog Museum in 1930. Okay, this is the Mingeikan, toward the standard of beauty. And this is his drawing of the Mingeikan as it was being built, or before it was being built. And this is the building. If you ever get to come, I would be more than happy to show you around. It is almost exactly the same. Fire restrictions had to make the museum renovated a bit. The idea of Mingei for historians and art professionals is probably more of the Edo period art, but interestingly enough, the Mingeikan opened with a new works exhibition, with Yanagi saying that the truth is both old and new. And even today, the Mingeikan holds a new works exhibition every year in December. So if you can come in December, there would be a new works exhibitions where everybody can purchase the newest works that have been created in the Mingei tradition. Okay, this is the Mingeikan shop. What makes the hand different from a machine is that it is always directly connected to the heart. The idea of Mingei was that it was not nostalgia, but something that touches you every day and that changes you every day. Beauty that can tolerate imperfection is more profound than the beauty that is unwilling to tolerate imperfection. Now, the Mingeikan collection shows works from all over the world. This is from Spain, this is from the Netherlands, this is from Sweden, this is from the Korean Peninsula, and this is from the Chinese tradition. But if you go look at this is all made in Japan. Now, everything strives, every country, every person strives for beauty. And beauty is also a way for enlightenment, is what Yanagi said. The question for handicrafts or Mingei is not technical, it's not only technological or economical, but very spiritual. Before Yanagi died, he emphasized lifestyles change, but the law of beauty does not. And today, Mingei artifacts are sold. They are still produced by the craftsman, and also today, as Yanagi expected, with the collaboration of designers. The enrichment of daily life with the real thing is what we want. And don't be disappointed for the new coming collector, because today is the start for every collector. So I'd like to ask you, is there tranquil beauty in your daily life? When did you last feel that subtle comfort and connectedness to the things that you are surrounded by? This is also the smile that Yanagi collected for the Mingeikan. And this is the final Mingeikan piece, one of my favorites, that is a symbol of longevity, that we will all be happy surrounded by beauty until the day our backs bend, but we still live in happiness. And I'd like to ask you, we often say, you are what you eat, but for us who love art, you are what you buy. Okay, this is the end of my talk. I hope I haven't gone too much over time. Thank you. All right. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Kiyoko. It was wonderful to hear your explanation of the enduring qualities of Mingei. And I'm very, very pleased you could join us today from Tokyo. It means so much to us to have the authenticity of your presentation and the remarkable history and commitment you have to this subject.
Much. Thank you. Thank you for inviting me. I'm very, very honored today. Thank you very much.
We'll be hearing from Kiyoko a little bit later again. We'll now turn to Tai Heineken, who has devoted his career and life to the study of traditional non-industrial Japan. He will begin by showing the Studio Japan and then the farmhouse that he lived in Yamagata in the mid-1970s, as well as a selection of a few objects that reflect his point of view. Tai, thank you.
Thank you, Amy. Thank you very much. Behind me is Studio Japan. And I want to thank you all for letting me into your day to speak about Mingei, a facet of Japan that I came to appreciate quite indirectly as an ethnologist. I'm speaking to you now from Studio Japan in Kingston, which you can see behind me as a green screen. If you could see the real studio, it would be covered in snow. Unfortunately, it's not there. The building, it was built upon 40 years ago. It was built from the frame of an 1885 barn that was at the back of our property in New Jersey. And 40 years ago, we modified it into Studio Japan, which is a Japanese cultural education center that houses art collection as well, which you can see in this photo. This is the entrance to the building. When you come in through the shoji, this is what you see. I am the curator. I am the conservator. I'm also the janitor because it is a dusty place and it smells of old wood. But it's a place where when we have school groups in, I allow the children to touch almost everything. Now, let me briefly try to explain to you the journey that brought me to Studio Japan. And it really all begins while I was a student at Leiden University. Leiden at that time, as it still does, it adjoins to the Dutch National Museum of Ethnology. And at that time, when I was a student, the museum contained the vast collection of an interesting German by the name of Philipp Franz von Siebold, which he assembled in Japan between 1823 and 1829, while he was the staff physician for the Dutch East India Company's settlement on Dejima Island in Nagasaki Harbor. When as a student, we heard and were told, we heard the rumor, and then we were told that a famous alumni of Leiden would be coming up from The Hague and giving an open lecture on von Siebold and his Japanese diaries. I was coaxed to attend by a student friend whose father had served with Ambassador Robert von Gulik in China during the war. Now, the reason for going to von Gulik's talk was not just to hear about von Siebold, because von Gulik was, shall we say, an enigmatic mystery that everybody was fascinated about, because he was also the author of very successful risque detective stories about a mysterious Chinese detective living in the Tang Dynasty period known as Judge Dee. And Judge Dee's stories, all written in English by von Gulik, many, many, many of them, were bestsellers throughout Europe and the United States as well. So von Gulik gave his lecture, an animated lecture, with wonderful risque anecdotes. And then at the end, there was a reception. And somehow I got pressed into the reception line by my friend, who introduced me to the ambassador as the great-great-grandson of Holland's first envoy to the United States under President John Adams in the year 1800. The next time I saw Van Gulik, I was again standing in a reception line to shake his hand. This was in 1965. And he had just been appointed the Dutch ambassador to Japan. So I went to the opening reception and stood in line. And again, I shook his hand and I reminded him of the time and place that we had first met. And he smiled at remembering my name. And artfully, he suggested, well, Heineken, we might sit down sometime and share a beer, which pleased me very much. Well, we never had that beer, but he did allow me on several occasions to join his entourage to visit favored antiquarians in Tokyo in search of antique brush pots for his collection. That was his passion. Through the ambassador and through others with refined taste and knowledge of Japan, which the ambassador already had, I tried to develop what I like to call my own von Siebold eye into the elemental Japan at that time. The next slide I want you to see is the farmhouse that I was able to obtain on a lease. I was privileged to be able to obtain on a lease. Here we are. This is my farmhouse located in the lower alpine area of the Tohoku region of northern Japan, still on Honshu Island. I was able to lease this abandoned building because the farmer had moved out and built a much better place. But the building still stood, and I was allowed to lease it. And I used it as my base from where I could reach out to the people that were around me to understand the traditional ethos that they were still attached to. Now, the objects that I'm going to show you now, and just a few of them, but these are objects that I'm going to be sharing with you that in many ways are not Mingei. I mean, I would really question whether they qualify for anybody's collection. But the objects are more than objects. They are the people that I came to know with the traditions that they were still attached to. The first objects I want to show you are two hawks from the village of Sasano, which from my farmhouse was less than a day's walk. From within a day, I could reach Sasano village if I wanted to walk there. The two hawks from Sasano village, the tall one is more than 200 years old. The little one next to it is barely 40. How these birds carved in Sasano became symbolic of the strength and courage and tenacity of not just Sasano, but the entire Tohoku area. In 1768, a teenage samurai inherited control of the Yonezawa fiefdom. The Yonezawa fiefdom at that time, Sasano was part of it, was so impoverished. It was so impoverished that the samurai, who was only 17, from the Uesugi clan, thought that he was being punished. It was so terrible. Well, instead of brooding, he decided to go out and change things. And his reforms were so fantastic that they have become legend in Japan. So I wanted to know more about that legend and how it affected Sasano. So I would go to Sasano regularly and sip tea and listen to stories and annoy people and watch carvers using wonderful special chisels to carve these birds. The next objects I want to show you, and there are three of them together, are a wonderful snow bonnet, which is actually typical of Japan before the war, made of broom straw and field grass and vine and fern frond. Given to me by a grandmother in a town. I had been invited to go to a town quite far north from where I was, where I was asked to read fairy tales in English to school kids with hopefully some theatrics included. And it was all in one day. And in return, I received some gifts. The beautiful snow boots here are actually typical of what would have been used in this town before rubber boots became popular. And I found them in a shoe shop in a bargain bin. The little doll is actually made by the school children that I spoke to, and it's dressed in the clothing that would be used for a child to go out on the task of moving snow from roofs of houses for, shall we say, some pin money. And the last object I want to share with you is a wood carving that actually came from, can we go to the wood carving? The wood carving is of a Buddhist deity known as Hote, the bearer of contentment in his linen sack. Well, I was asked to go and help with a local farmer who I knew, whose son had helped me with snow shoveling, to help prepare several outbuildings in preparation for the coming cherry harvest, because this farmer his business was raising cherries, and the harvest would come in June, and we wanted to clear the space for the cherries. So I'm in a disused shed, and I'm working through a box, a broken box, the bottom of which I found this carving, which I immediately recognized who the carving was. And I said, my goodness, I want to know more about this. So I went to the farmer, Nakamura, and I said, Nakamura-san, tell me some story about this wonderful carving. Nakamura took the carving, held it at arm's length, and with a disdainful voice said, "This is a piece of junk." And I said, "But it's beautiful." He said, "Heineken, this is disgraceful. Who would want to own such a terrible thing?" So Nakamura junk became Thai Heineken junk. Thank you very much for your time.
Thai, we thank you so much for bringing the reality into your presentation. And we look forward to discussing further your ideas and what you feel are your criteria for collecting Mingei. We thank you very much.
Thank you, Amy.
And now I'd like to introduce our third speaker, David Kahn, who will speak about his collection of Mingei.
Okay, so well, thank you very much, Amy, and I'm absolutely delighted to have the opportunity to share my enthusiasm for Mingei with JASA's members and friends. So my interest in Japan began at the tender age of 9. My family and I spent a weekend at the Japanese-style hotel on the mountain in Hilburn, New York. And there was, of course, a gift shop, and it was filled with Japanese craft. On the wall there was a kite in the shape of an insect, just a beautiful, what I thought was a work of art. I had to have it. And that was my first acquisition for all of $1.50. And that set me on a trajectory to collect Japanese folk toys, kites, masks, and other craft materials while I was very young. I was an unusual child. At the age of 16, I went to Europe for the first time, spent a year in Spain. And at that point, I sort of turned away from Japan and more towards European art. But there's a happy ending to this story. When I was in the mid-'80s, I paid a first visit to Japan. And at that point, my childhood interest in Japanese aesthetics all came rushing back. It was reignited. And I started to visit Japan on a regular basis. And I began collecting kites again. I eventually put together quite a collection. And in 2013-14, a portion of my collection was displayed at the Museum of International Folk Art in Santa Fe. Helen, could you advance the next slide? There's having a little trouble here making it move.
Hi, David. You're the one sharing your screen, but I am happy to take over screen share if you'd like. Hold on.
Yeah, okay.
Just give me 2 seconds.
Anyway, as I was saying, I put together a collection of Japanese kites. Yep, that would be great. And this is just one example. Later in, say, the late 1980s, early 1990s, I became interested in Mingei. I acquired a couple of books on the subject. I visited the Mingeikan, of course, which is just a fabulous museum, and a friend introduced me to temple markets in Tokyo. And at that point, I started going to temple markets everywhere. The next slide is fine, thank you, Helen. I started going to antique shows, traveled from the north all the way to the south, visiting antique dealers. So it's been about 30 years now since I've been collecting Mingei. And what I'm going to do is show you some examples of things from my collection. I consider these to be sort of classic examples of Mingei. Of course, they don't compare to what the Mingeikan has. And as I show these, I'm going to talk a little bit about how they do and don't maybe fit with the standard definition of Mingei. And I'll read a review of a book on Mingei that just came out. A reviewer notes that Mingei items must be made by hand in quantity by anonymous artisans. They must be inexpensive and representative of the regions in which they were produced. They must be functional and used by people in their daily lives. And I guess my view is our definition of Mingei needs to be flexible. In some cases, materials do correspond to that definition, in some cases not. So I'm beginning here with a futonji, a bedding cover. This was made to be part of a bride's wedding trousseau. It was a resist-dyed textile that was then hand-painted. It bears a mon, or family crest. And one of the interesting things about this is that it's in perfect condition. Although theoretically intended to be a futon cover, it was obviously never used. And I would suggest that this is probably because it was considered to be so good, so expensive, so rare and valuable that people didn't want to use it. And instead it was tucked away and kept as an heirloom. Next slide, please. This is another futonji made in the exact same way as the first one that we looked at. And again, in perfect condition, never used, probably more of an heirloom than an item for daily use. This one lacks a mon or crest. Now, I've always wondered why some have crests, some don't. Was that a question of cost? Did it cost money to create a stencil that could be used for a mon? Not sure. Next one, please, Amy. Helen, sorry. Here we have another resist-dyed textile. In this case, it's a little earlier than the first two that we saw. And what's interesting about this is that I was able to find the print source. Is the print on the right by Kuniyoshi, dating to 1860. And sometimes we might think of Mingei artisans as being hidden away in their workshops, simply reproducing designs that have been handed down to them over the ages. But instead, I think many of the artisans were in fact looking at what was going on in the larger artistic world around them and adapting what they saw there to their own crafts. Next, please. This is a bast textile. It's made of hemp. This is an uchikui from Okinawa. In this case, the design and the colors were created with stencils. And unlike the last textile we saw, the design here, you can see in textiles going back to the 18th century, and people still are copying this pattern to this day. So in fact, you do have many textiles, ceramics, other materials where the same design appears century in, century out. Next, please. This is another hemp textile, a norin or shop curtain from Tohoku. And the theme of, or the motif of rabbits running over the waves goes back in Japan hundreds of years before this textile was made. However, in this case, I think the artisan, or I would really call him an artist, adapted that motif and made something really creative and new and bold out of it. These rabbits are not only running over the waves, they're actually frolicking over the waves. It's a wonderful work of art. Next, please. I want to show two last textiles. These are both noragi, or workman's coats from Tohoku. They're made of hemp-like fabric. After hemp thread is woven, there's a waste left over, and the waste is used to create this textile called okuso. And the okuso textiles were only made during the Meiji period. And I show these primarily to demonstrate that not all folk textiles from Japan are indigo dyed only. You see other colors, although they're rare. Next, please. Turning to ceramics, these are two very large Takeo bowls. And Kiyoko actually showed a version of the one on the left earlier that's in the Mingeikan. These are so huge, they're over 50 centimeters in diameter. You could bathe a baby in them. And these designs, interestingly, are produced in the late 17th century up through the middle of the 19th century. The colors change and the patterns change to some extent, but they're basically the same designs that last over a very long period of time. Next, please. On the left, these are wonderful large jars. The one on the left is a Takeo Jar, just like the two large bowls that we just saw. Again, this form survives over a period of over 200 years. The profile changes a little bit, that helps with the dating. And usually they have pine designs. This is very unusual to have a plum tree design. On the right is another large jar, a nice Shirogawa jar of these, for whatever reason, seems to have only been produced during the mid-Edo period. And they're very unusual for a Japanese ceramic in that they have applied design, in this case, vines and flowers. You really don't see that elsewhere. Next, please. Perhaps one of the most typical Mingei ceramics would be the stone plate or ishizara. These were generated or made in the Seto area. You see a million different designs for these plates. And I think that signifies that their creators were basically, they were operating in markets and they were looking to generate new designs that would attract buyers. These are two very unusual designs here. Probably the most common design is the willow tree pattern. This well on the left, it's the only example I know of with this design. I've seen a couple of the hawk design on the right. I might also point out that on the well design one, there's a rebus there, which is very complicated, and I won't try to explain it, but it raises the question as to whether ceramics like these were sometimes commissioned. Did a simple potter decorator come up with the idea of including this very complicated rebus on this piece? I think probably not. Next, please. Equally well known with the ishizara are the oil plates or lamp plates. These were placed at the bottom of a lamp to catch oil drippings. And like the ishizara, these come in a wide variety of designs. Again, I think their creators were constantly looking at the market and trying to come up with new designs to sell their goods as opposed to other people selling theirs. Next, please. And the last ceramic I wanted to show, or a number of them, these are tokuri or sake bottles or flasks. These were produced in kilns all over Japan, and you can see there are various techniques here. There's stamping, there's incising. On the lower left, the decorator used his fingers to create these wavy designs in the slip. These, although they all appear here to be the same size, they range from 18 inches in height to 35 inches. And some of these designs you find used generation after generation, others not. The pine tree one on the lower level, that again is a Takeo ceramic, and you do see these designs from the late 17th century to the middle of the 19th. Next, please. I wanted to sort of wrap up by just touching on a few artifacts from the what I might call the spiritual world, the commercial world, and the world of recreation. Here we have a pair of shishigashira or lion dog heads or masks. These one would typically see used during the New Year celebration to welcome in the new year. They're also used for other celebrations. And in this case, these have inscriptions inside which suggest that they were presented to a Shinto shrine on or around Tabenata in 1738. So these were probably used for the Tabenata festival. These shishigashira come down to us in fairly large numbers. I've only seen 2 pairs in the literature other than this pair. And that raises a question for me anyway as to whether there used to be more pairs and the pairs were all broken up and that's why we mostly see only singles these days, or were pairs always rare and unusual. Next, please. This is one of my favorite items in my collection. It's the Tano Kami god. It's a fertility god. People would take statues of Tano Kami and put him out in rice fields to welcome a bountiful harvest. The design is really powerful. It epitomizes everything that is Mingei. For me, these statues always have wonderful expressions. And in case you're wondering, you can always identify Tano Kami by the rice paddle he holds in one hand and the rice bowl in the other. And I mentioned that he's a fertility god, so if you turn him around, what you see is a phallus, but we're not going there because this is a family program. Could I have the next, please? We can't talk about Mingei without talking about Kanban or shop signs. Some of you may remember the Kanban exhibit that was presented at the Japan Society in 1983. More recently, there was one at the Mingei International Museum in San Diego in 2017. This is a late Kanban, and this was produced by a sort of patent medicine maker. And these would have been sent out to drugstores. So these would have been made in quantity and distributed to drugstores to promote a particular product and not a drugstore in general. And this drug is, you'll be happy to know, it's good for brain disease and nervous disorders. And we could probably all use a little of this during the pandemic. Next slide, please. This is another unusual sort of Kanban. It's a representation of a portable candlestick. These fold up and can be folded flat and taken on a trip. The thing is, in this case, this is about 3 times the size of an actual portable candlestick. It's about 80 centimeters high. And so I believe this is something that was really set up in the candle maker's shop as a demonstration of his wares that he was capable of making. Next, please. And we've already seen a kite, but in the area of recreation, entertainment, this is a set of 3 battledores, hagoita, shuttlecock paddles that would have been used by young ladies to play shuttlecock during the New Year celebrations. And you see various celebrants welcoming in the new year here. And 2 of the 3 actually have shishigashira on them as well. Next. And this is my final slide, and I guess this falls into the category of fun and games, but this appears to be a folding umbrella, traditional casa, but what it actually is, excuse me, is a tokery. There's a cap that comes off what appears to be the handle, and you could pump about 2 quarts of liquid into this. And I assume it was probably taken on picnics or other outdoor, for other outdoor recreation. I doubt that something like this would have been used in the home or at a feast or an inn. Very interesting item. And the last, please. And this is where I'm going to end. I look forward to the conversation that we're going to have about Mingei, and hope I was able to give you a little idea of the range of artifacts that fall into this category. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much, David. And I'd like to invite our other guest speakers to join us on the screen for a moment. Kiyoko, we just need to see your image. Thank you so much.
Here we go.
This is really what we had hoped for today. Three very different approaches to the subject, all perhaps tied to a discussion of Yanagi Sensei, but I think that raises a lot of questions for us. The one thing that is tried and true about your presentations is your dedication to the subject, your absolute enthusiasm for it, and you each have very specific criteria. So one of the questions I'd like to ask, and maybe we'll start now with David. What are your criteria for collecting Mingei?
Oh boy, that's kind of a complicated question, but you know, over the years, I've seen thousands and thousands of items, needless to say. And so I look for something that is unusual or a particularly well executed example of something that I'm familiar with. On occasion, I'll be looking for an older or better example of something I have in my collection. But I think overall, it's always, I'm looking for things that are moving, and the things that I showed you fall into that category. And I mentioned the kite I bought at the age of 9. I fell in love with that. And so I'm looking for things to fall in love with. And Kiyoko, I have to thank you for mentioning you are what you buy. Thank you so much. I'd never heard that before.
I sort of invented that, but I was really amazed with the beauty of your collection. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And Kiyoko, did you want to say something about your own interest, your personal interest in collecting?
Well, I have been lucky because I was at the Mingeikan for more than 20 years, maybe 25 years. So every year with the new works exhibition, I got to see the works coming in. I got to help. They're all judged and classified as, some are awarded medals, classified A, B, and C. C are returned to the creators, but works that are A and B, they go on display. Museums come in first to purchase them, and then the average public is allowed to come in to purchase all the items. And because of that, I didn't mean to collect, but I ended up with a lot of very nice things. So I think I'm very lucky.
Do you want to just discuss that wonderful piece behind you?
Yes, this is a Onda, a plate from Kyushu, Onda kiln. Actually, it's like as large as David's Ishizara, maybe a little bit smaller, but it's huge. And it is one of the kilns, so-called the people's kilns, not a governmental kiln, that Yanagi and his friends, Bernard Leach and Kawai Kanjo, they're all potters, stopped by and said, this is a beautiful expression of the local people. So this is one of the pieces. I hope you can visit someday.
It is beautiful. It's beautiful.
It is. And I know you have other objects that are so meaningful to you. Do you want to discuss that as part of your criteria for collecting?
Well, I'm actually a little bit speechless and embarrassed because I'm not a collector. I'm an ethnologist that acquires things, and most of them are connected to people. So when I get involved with a person and I try to get into their ethos, I'm speaking of Japanese now, that person becomes or something that is part of that person that then I acquire either as a gift or I've paid for it or whatever. But for me, that object is that person. So I don't see objects separate from people. Now that's because I'm an ethnologist. I'm not a collector. And so if you come into the studio, and I let the objects in the studio speak to the people that visit the studio. and the voices are different for each person that comes in. So for example, and Amy, I mentioned this to Amy, my favorite piece of Mingei is this, which is a very, very old, beautifully patinated noodle scoop. Well, a bamboo noodle scoop hanging on the wall of a farmhouse, probably for the last 100 years, would drive. This is like going to a museum in Europe and finding a Van Dyck that's never been shown before. So David's collection is so wonderfully sophisticated, and Kyoko, your explanation of the essence of the Mingeikan was so beautifully articulated. Thank you both very, very much. But I am basically, for good or ill, other than Tansu, because I'm known as sort of the expert on the evolution of Japanese Tansu as mobile cabinetry. But as far as Mingei, my Mingei are more junk than they are art. And that is just because I am an acquirer of things that I am attached to and I find beautiful. But that beauty that I see is so completely subjective, it's very difficult to articulate as an aesthetic. And I have to admit that honestly.
Well, we don't need any admissions. We love looking at objects with you, Ty, and have for many, many, many years.
Well, I want you to come down and see me in Kingston, and I'll drag out all sorts of junk for you.
Okay. Several people have raised a question which we've been considering over these past few weeks together in our discussions. And that is really, what is the position of folk art in museums and public collections, particularly in America? And another question David has raised and maybe would like to discuss this evening is why we don't see more of Mingei exhibited in our own museums that feature Japanese art.
Well, I think the major reason is that great gulf that exists between what we call fine arts and decorative arts. And I studied as an art historian, and in my day, decorative arts simply weren't on the horizon at all. They weren't even a topic of discussion. And I think that still persists to this day, so that when you look at exhibits in most museums that have Japanese collections on view, you tend to see the screens or the scroll paintings or the statues that came out of the temples, but you don't see much in terms of the everyday arts. There are some exceptions. The Seattle Art Museum often has a lot of textiles on view, but I think it's that old dichotomy between fine art and decorative art that really drives this.
Would anyone else like to care to add something to that, or can we move on?
I'd like to add something.
No, please.
The Peabody Museum in Salem, Massachusetts. It is in Massachusetts, or is it in New Hampshire? I don't remember.
Massachusetts.
Yeah, but that collection from Morse, the eye of Edward Morse is very similar to the eye that I tried to develop. If we look at von Siebold, and most of the von Siebold collection is now in its own museum on the Rattenberg in Amsterdam, in Leiden. Some of it's still at the Ethnographic Museum at Leiden. But this way of looking at things as utilitarian objects that inform, the function is what leads the form. And so in Kyoko's comment, she mentioned that, and although you did not mention the name of the founder of the Bauhaus, Gropius, when he came to Japan and he went to the Mingeikan, and then he went around looking at architecture everywhere, and he realized that the emptiness that is elemental to Japanese understanding of the Japanese word nagare, which means flow, the emptiness of things is not emptiness. You are filling things with nothingness. And nothingness itself is aesthetic. So the concept of less is more. When Gropius came back and he wrote about his wonderful experience in Japan, and the translation from the German was, the Japanese were 1,000 years ahead of me, you know? I just, but when you go to the Peabody, and you see what Morse collected, or when you go and see the von Siebel collection on the Rappenberg, you get that feeling, that elemental feeling of the sensuality of the things that these men saw, because they had sensualized, they did not have artistic eyes. And that sensuality is what I love in what we're now calling Mingei. But keep in mind, many of these wonderful things that we classify as Mingei were made by indentured workers who basically could not escape from the work that had been given to them, the chore that had been given to them. And it was terrible. I have stencils that are so intricate. They're obviously made by young girls who had been sold to these factories to make these stencils out of rice paper and then dipped into persimmon tannin. And maybe after a year or 2 or 3 years of work, the worker was discarded because their eyes became so bad. There is that element to this. And Yanagi, as a humanist, because Yanagi was a humanist, he was a pacifist and he was a humanist, and he saw this human element to everything, whether in Korea or Japan, that he saw as beautiful. But he realized there was a human component to it.
So thank you, Ty. I would like us to give a little bit of time to our audience, and there have been several questions on another topic that I think that Kiyoko has covered and perhaps she would like to address, and that is looking at specific artists who are associated with Mingei. You mentioned some in your presentation, and you actually showed pictures of Hamada and other artists of ceramics and other things who were very much a part of this movement. Can you say a few words on that for us?
Yes. Yanagi, of course, he even wrote that, he writes, I am not an artist. I am a man of words, but it is my artist friends that are expressing what I cannot. Of course, he was a designer that was able to present them in a way that they would be appreciated. And also he is so-called the discoverer of the woodblock printer Shiko Munakata. So the individual artist was important from the beginning. There's also a question about how tea, the history of tea, is connected with Mingei, or if it is not connected with Mingei. It is, because it was the great tea master Seeing Eye that impressed Yanagi to say that everybody can cultivate the Seeing Eye as well, and that the tea is the law of beauty. So it is both the average person, the craftsperson, and the artist that would create a beautiful lifestyle as a whole, is what Yanagi was trying to say.
Thank you. We had some specific questions related to tea, but I think that you really have addressed this in a very helpful way. Frank Chance has a question for Mimura Sensei. Some sources read Yanagi's name as Munemitsu rather than Soetsu. Can you please talk about which you prefer and why?
Okay, well, it's Muneyoshi, and in a Japanese traditional way of reading his name is Yanagi Muneyoshi. But when Yanagi went to Harvard, a little bit before Harvard, he started signing his papers, his letters as Soetsu. It's another way of reading the same Chinese characters. One is probably he thought it was easier to pronounce and read instead of Mune Yoshi in English, but also one of his most revered teachers and friends at the end was the great Buddhist philosopher Daisetsu Suzuki. So it was Daisetsu and Soetsu is one of also the reasons why he wrote Soetsu. And that's why, because if I speak in English, I would use his English signature that he wrote as Soetsu.
We have a number of questions directed to you, and then we'll go on to our questions for the other speakers. We've also been asked about the way the museum has traditionally, the Mingeikan has traditionally shown their objects. As you may know, Felice Fisher, a very prominent curator from the Philadelphia Museum of Art, has asked, on visits to the Mingeikan, I've always wondered about the small wood label tags and the lack of explanatory labels. How or if does this reflect Yanagi Sensei's philosophy of Mingei?
Yes, thank you very much for the very important and good question. Yanagi always said at the beginning to see first and know later. That it's a term that he always used, and if there are too many words in a caption that would explain, for example, the date of where it was made and the technique and all that, then people will, the viewer will already have the colored eyes of seeing how it is explained. But first, to feel in the heart and to accept your aesthetic instinct first was what Yanagi considered very important, because he said the brain should be not clouded, and your instinct should come first. But of course, knowledge was very important. So see first, know later was what he also wrote.
There are so many questions. I don't think in any of our programs we've had as many people who step up to the plate with specific questions. And while we can't answer all of them, I'd like to turn to Andrew Maskey's question for any or all of the panelists. What single thing would you want young people today to understand about Mingei and its makers?
I think David would be good to answer that.
Well, I think, it's the Japanese aesthetic. There's just something unbelievable about the way that Japanese designers can synthesize things and get them down to their basics. And, maybe it goes more into the spiritual realm that Kiyoko was talking about. It's to truth. And, beauty is truth. So that would be my thought.
There are also some questions from our audience about other types of objects that were not discussed tonight, such as are dolls considered Mingei? And would you also consider the objects that were presented this evening from Tai that were utilitarian objects from Yamagata? Do you all feel that that is also represented as Mingei?
Well, I'll say, sure, absolutely, they are. And Tai, I never told you I had one of those falcons when I was a kid as well. So that's something I bought early on. But to the point of dolls, well, that's a very interesting question. And I would say some yes, some no. I actually do collect Tsuchi Ningyo, which are clay dolls from Fushimi and other places. Gosho Ningyo, which are from the court and very costly. They were produced at the court for presentation as gifts. Is that a folk art? I don't know. I'll let Kiyoko answer that one.
Yes, Yanagi did include dolls, but more of the type that I think David is collecting. Gosho Ningyo, these court taste items, not all of them were included because if they became too expensive, and difficult to produce. It was more of an artistic, not an everyday thing, but dolls were included in Mingei as an important part of daily life, as part of representing an annual seasonal cycle, like the Girls' Day dolls or the Boys' Day dolls, things like that. But a lot of the things that were included in the Mingeikan collection, for example, were more of paper mache or of clay.
I think that in the when we present this program in video on our YouTube channel, I think we should provide the addresses of some of the museums and centers, including Tai and Kiyoko Heineken's Studio Japan, where people can see these types of objects. And I speak from my own institution where I worked for many, many years. The Brooklyn Museum has a very, very extensive collection of Mingei. And unfortunately, at the moment, the collection is not able to be shown. But that shouldn't stop people from visiting. And I hope that people will continue to pursue this subject. And obviously, with so many visitors this evening, we really have had an opportunity to show something that is very much needed in our community. And that is to look at this subject more deeply, more profoundly than we have. And we hope that all of you, especially our three speakers and many of our attendees, will come to us to make another program, perhaps even more specific. But tonight's program, and I'm sorry to bring it to a close, but we thank you for such a lively conversation and stimulating program and wonderful, wonderful images. We thank each of you tremendously and our guests as well. We hope that you will join us for our next JASA webinar, which will be at 6 p.m. Eastern Standard Time on Wednesday, February 17th, for a presentation co-sponsored by the International Netsuke Society, with a special talk on Netsuke and Sagemono in the Year of the Ox by collector Dr. David Butsumio. An invitation has been distributed this week and information is provided on our JASA website. And finally, I'd like to also note that our annual publication, Impressions, and I happen to have my new issue here, is being issued in two parts. The first part has been distributed and should be reaching our JASA members very soon. So once again, to thank our members of JASA for joining us this evening, and especially our distinguished speakers. Good night, and thank you.